Hey, welcome. And we are live, I believe. Just make sure everything's right here. So, welcome to the second edition of the Tim Thoughts Book Club. A few pages. I was gonna put this up here. So this is our book today, Osamu Dazai's No Longer Human. In case you missed out on the first live stream, we'll be just kind of going through and talking about the book. At first, I'll give a brief, hopefully like non-spoilery overview in case you haven't read the book and you just are interested in what it's about and wanted to read it yourself eventually and maybe come back later and see what we talked about and so on and so on. If you have anything you'd like to say or talk about, feel free to jump in at any point and, bring up whatever is interesting to you. Starting with this book, just a brief sort of little review of what I thought. I thought the book is excellently written. It is a bit, it's pretty heavy, can get pretty dark at times, but I think that the way that it's written offers this deep insight into the sort of ideas and thoughts that people have that suffer from severe depression and anxiety. Just as an aside real quick, for anybody watching this that may be sensitive to topics like depression, suicide, addiction, things like that, just wanted to let you know that those are the sorts of topics that are prevalent throughout this book. And so if those sorts of things are triggering for you, just be aware of that. And, hopefully this doesn't, spring any surprises on you that you guys weren't ready for. Just wanted to let you know that that's sort of what this book is about and what happens throughout the entirety of the book. So this is actually set sometime in the 1930s, 40s Japan, and I think 1930s primarily. And it follows the main character, Yozo, who comes from a pretty wealthy family in more of the Japanese countryside. His father is like a member of the Diet, like the Japanese sort of parliament of the time, where the governmental ruling class, essentially. And Yozo is one of many children, and the book is actually told as a series of notebooks from his perspective. So and his life is split into these three notebooks, starting with, his early youth, into his sort of high school age, and then on to sort of college and beyond. And then there are sort of two perspectives offered. One is, of course, Yozo himself, who wrote the notebooks. And then there is an outside narrator who writes the prologue and the epilogue, sort of talking about each notebook in a different outside perspective. And so I thought that a good way to sort of lead into this would be to read the last page of the introduction by the translator of the book. Like, this is not a part of the actual novel, but it's the translator who translated the original novel from Japanese to English, Donald Keene, and this is the final page of his introduction. And I feel like this is a sort of a good overview, description of the book in general. So I thought I would read that to start things off. So he says, "No Longer Human is almost symbolic of the predicament of the Japanese writers today. It is the story of a man who is orphaned from his fellows by their refusal to take him seriously. He is denied the love of his father, taken advantage of by his friends, and finally in turn is cruel to the women who love him. He does not insist because of his experiences that the others are all wrong and he is alone right. On the contrary, he records with devastating honesty his every transgression of a code of human conduct which he cannot fathom. Yet, as Dazai realized, if the, quote, I of the novel did not, the cowardly acts and moments of abject collapse do not tell the whole story. In a superb epilogue, the only objective witness testifies, quote, he was an angel, and we are suddenly made to realize the incompleteness of Yozo's portrait of himself. In the way that most men fail to see their own cruelty, Yozo had not noticed his gentleness and his capacity for love. Yozo's experiences are certainly not typical of all Japanese intellectuals, but the sense of isolation which they feel between themselves and the rest of the world is perhaps akin to Yozo's conviction that he alone is not, quote, human. Again, his frustrations at the university, his unhappy involvement with the Communist Party, his disastrous love affairs, all belong to the past of many writers of today. At the same time, detail after detail is clearly derived from the individual experience of Osamu Dazai himself. The temptation is strong to consider the book as a barely fictionalized autobiography, but this would be a mistake, I am sure. Dazai had the creative artistry of a great cameraman. His lens is often trained on moments of his own past, but thanks to his brilliant skill in composition and selection, his photographs are not what we expect to find cluttering an album. There is nothing of the meandering reminiscer of Dazai. With him, all is sharp, brief, and evocative. Even if each scene of No Longer Human were the exact reproduction of an incident from Dazai's life, of course this is not the case, his technique would qualify the whole of the work as one of original fiction. No Longer Human is not a cheerful book, yet its effect is far from that of a painful wound gratuitously inflicted on the reader. As a reviewer, Richard Gilman of Jubilee wrote of Dazai's earlier novel, quote, such is the power of art to transfigure what is objectively ignoble or depraved, that the setting sun is actually deeply moving and even inspiriting. To know the nature of despair and to triumph over it in the ways that are possible to oneself. Imagination was Dazai's only weapon, is surely a sort of grace. Donald Keene. So, I just feel like this is a perfect encapsulation of the novel in one sort of brief passage. And of course, who else besides the one who translated this book and brought it to the Western audience would be the one to describe it so well. Another interesting note from the introduction that Donald Keene talks about is the the way that Western and Japanese culture are divided, and yet, are crossed, and in many ways, both cultures sort of appropriate the other. And I think he offers a good bit of perspective when he says that, in Dazai's case and Yozo's case, coming from a wealthy family, they were quite well exposed to Western media, books, literature, paintings, art, etc. And so they actually know and are well acquainted with quite a few of the popular Western works at the time, and resultingly, may reference them or know of them or be influenced by them, but also not necessarily in the ways that these same works might influence us Westerners who actually come from that culture. And that's sort of the same thing that happens when Westerners quote unquote appropriate Japanese culture, right? It's not exactly the same. It's not identical. Westerners don't drink green tea and wear kimonos the same way that Japanese people do, and Japanese people probably don't glean, the same sorts of insights from Western literature and art that more, a mind that was grown in the Western mentality would. It's a very interesting way that he describes the difference between the sort of Eastern and Western cultures. And so I thought a good way to sort of lead into the discussion coming up would be to go over just sort of chronologically what happens in the book, and then, so we can all sort of catch up, get a brief overview of what happened throughout the book, and then we can sort of dive into the finer details of what exactly occurred, why, they're impactful, and what they meant to both Yozo and Dazai, and sort of what Dazai was, what Dazai was trying to convey through this work. So, starting off, in the prologue, we have a third party, a narrator, who is describing these three portraits of Yozo. And let's see. So if we look at that, it's kind of striking the way that he describes these portraits. So initially, we don't know anything about Yozo, obviously, starting the book. But after reading the book, looking back on this introduction, it's interesting to see how he's depicted. There are three portraits, one of him as a child, one of him as sort of an adolescent, and one of him as an adult. And the way that they're described in the beginning, we don't know much about Yozo at all, or these portraits, and actually these portraits are the first glimpse of him that we get. And I thought this passage, this quote was pretty interesting, because the first picture is of a child who seems to be smiling, but the more you look at it, the more sort of disturbing it becomes. The more carefully you examine the child's smiling face, the more you feel an indescribable, unspeakable horror creeping over you. Because it's not a smiling face at all. It's not a suggestion of a smile. He has tightly clenched fists. And this is actually evocative of how Yozo acted when he was a child. He became a comedian in order to better relate to people, even though he himself didn't really find the comedy, the act, all that compelling. It was just a way for him to relate to other people. And so this is the first portrait we see. And then the second portrait, again, the face fails inexplicably to give the impression of belonging to a living human being. He has an adroit smile, like a calculated smile, as if he knows specifically exactly how he's posed and what he's doing in order to portray this image of himself that, that would fool people into believing that he is who he wants you to believe he is, And then the third is the remaining photograph is the most monstrous of all. It is quite impossible to even guess the age, though the hair seems to be streaked somewhat with gray, in the corner of an extraordinarily dirty room. I think that even a death mask would hold more of an expression, leave more of a memory. That effigy suggests nothing so much as a human body to which a horse's head has been attached. Something ineffable makes the beholder shudder in distaste. I have never seen such an inscrutable face on a man. And so when you're reading this the first time, it's kind of like, oh my god, like what is this picture, and why does this guy look like that? But then after you read the whole book, it really comes full circle, and you understand that, like, yeah, he's lived a life. And also, when you first read this, you may think the man is like in his 60s or 70s, the way he's described, sort of on his deathbed, but we later find that he was probably in his late 20s, if not early 30s, depending on when exactly this portrait was taken. So already, the introduction hits you with this sort of heaviness and paints these pictures of three photographs of the same man over the course of his lifetime, and all of them seem incredibly strained and not exactly evocative or reminiscent of a human being you would want to talk to or actually interact with. And unfortunately, that is actually extremely accurate to who Yozo was, and the way that he talked to people and the way that he just sort of interacted with society at large. And then so moving ahead onto the timeline here, we head into notebook number 1, And the way he starts the whole book, or his first notebook, is when he was much younger and lived in the countryside. And he describes this idea that he never was hungry, both literally and figuratively. He never had a hunger for food, and he never had a hunger for just about anything. He never really wanted for things. He never really had this innate hunger inside of him to reach for a particular goal or skill set or relationship or anything like that. He was sort of devoid of passion, I guess you could say. And this leads to, right here, the clown. It leads to him trying to find a way to relate to the people around him, because he is so removed from how he considers humans to be. He thinks that humans live this sort of life that he doesn't have access to. He feels like back then they didn't have robots, but I imagine if he wrote this in modern day, he may write something akin to like being a robot, or, sort of like philosophically bankrupt. It's like he doesn't have the same passions and motivations and desires that one would expect of a regular human being. And I think just right from the start, he's already sort of qualifying himself as a person who's like unperson, a human who's inhuman, and not because of his, anger, or not because of his, there's no malice. It's just that he is so deep in this, I guess what we may today call clinical depression. He's so deep in this state of depression that he has no real inkling to act and live as a human being. And then so, yes, the next sort of event I highlighted is the lion's mask. And so this was an event in the story where his father, who is a wealthy politician, is about to go on another trip to Tokyo, and he always brings back his children souvenirs and gifts and things. And so he sits each one of his children down one by one and asks them, what do you want? And of course, a regular child is like, oh, I want sweets, I want toys, I want this and that and so on. And it's really easy usually for a child to say what they want. But even from such an early age, Yozo felt this hollowness, this emptiness within him, that he literally didn't want anything. He didn't even know what he wanted. And he was aware of the fact that he didn't know what he wanted. And so he didn't know what to say. Oops, sorry about that. And he didn't know what to say. So his father sort of looks at him with, a look of almost disgust, distaste, this idea that like this boy, my son, I'm a successful politician, and my son doesn't want anything, doesn't know what he wants. How strange is that? So he offers, oh, you want the lion's mask, right? Or like maybe his brother does or something like that. And then it sort of all just like slinks away, and Yozo feels really bad about it. So then he sneaks into his father's office, writes down in his notebook, oh, a lion's mask. And then his father is sort of relieved by that, because he comes home and he like tells his wife, oh, Yozo wanted wanted the lion's mask, and he wrote it down in my notebook. He was just too shy to say something. And this is sort of sets Yozo on the path to becoming this comedian, to becoming deceitful, to lie and cheat and just say whatever he needs to say to get people to trust him and to like him, and to craft this image of the person that he thinks other people want him to be. And to me, that's why this was such a key moment in the book. Not to mention that it, is a moment that so specifically and strongly deals with an interaction with his father, who will, for the rest of the novel, become this pervasive, overarching presence that sort of looms over Yozo in just about every major life decision that he has to make. And then we get into, let's see, this respect, this idea of respect. What exactly did he say? I think I would like to look at this passage here. So let's check this out. Yes, right here. So this is sort of when he's talking about school and being the clown and so on, and just trying to it's one of his philosophical musings on like life and ideas and so on. So he says, let's see. Yes, this is when he's talking about his schooling and how he gets good grades and everything like that. So he says, I was well on my way to winning respect, but the idea of being respected used to intimidate me excessively. My definition of a respected man was one who had succeeded almost completely in hoodwinking people, but who was finally seen through by some omniscient, omnipotent person who ruined him and made him suffer a shame worse than death. Even supposing I could deceive most human beings into respecting me, one of them would know the truth, and sooner or later other human beings would learn from him. What would be the wrath and vengeance of those who realized how they had been tricked? That was a hair-raising thought. So, this is like, I mean, just reading this as a sort of human, I guess, Yozo would consider me a human. It's like, it's so sad. It's like he actually sees the idea of respect as something to be feared, as something, a shame worse than death, to be respected. And, as a sort of regular person, I consider respect to be one of the things I may, try and attempt to gain from other people, right? Like, I would like to be respected for the work that I do, for, the sorts of things that I can do for other people, and the things that I've accomplished or created. I feel that respect is a great sort of form of compensation or gratitude for those acts. And yet Yozo, even from such a young age, like elementary school age, he felt that respect was a shame worse than death. Just as an aside, what I did want to bring up, which we can come back to later, was that, all of these notebooks are actually written from the future perspective of Yozo. So I think when the novel ends, sort of during the epilogue or like at the end of the third notebook, I think he wrote all of these notebooks from that perspective. So that's sort of an interesting thing to keep in mind about the perspective of each of these notebooks that he's written. It's that he may have felt these things to a certain degree at that time in his life, but also the fact that he wrote these notebooks when he had sort of already lived his life to completion, or at least the most interesting aspects of his life. He has a completely different perspective on the situations that made him and the people that he interacted with that made him. So now he is somebody essentially totally different. And while undoubtedly there must be elements of truth in what he said about these different stages in his life at the time, there is also undoubtedly extra color added to them by the perspective of this man who had lived such a troublesome and depressing life for 30 or so years. So anyway, getting back to the timeline here. I kind of missed this a little bit. The servants should come first because they're actually right here. So this is actually something that I completely missed the first time I had read through this, and it wasn't until I looked it up later and was sort of digesting the text that I was able to see, a synopsis and understand exactly what happened. So now we sort of come to the point where there is a sexual trauma in this book. So just, another sort of warning for anybody who is sensitive to that kind of topic. We'll be sort of going into that territory now. So he says here, this is shortly after he talked about the whole respect thing. Already by that time, I had been taught a lamentable thing by the maids and manservants. I was being corrupted. I now think that to perpetrate such a thing on a small child is the ugliest, vilest, crudest crime a human being can commit, but I endured it. I even felt as if it enabled me to see one more particular aspect of human beings. I smiled in my weakness. If I had formed the habit of telling the truth, I might perhaps have been able to confide unabashedly to my father or mother about the crime, but I could not fully understand even my own parents. To appeal for help to any human being, I could expect nothing from that expedient. Supposing I complained to my father or my mother, or to the police, the government, I wondered if in the end I would not be argued into silence by someone in good graces with the world, by the excuses of which the world approved. It is only too obvious that favoritism inevitably exists. It would have been useless to complain to human beings. So I said nothing of the truth. I felt I had no choice but to endure whatever came my way and go on playing the clown. So, fully understanding the context of what he's actually saying, it's extremely depressing, honestly. Like, he was sexually assaulted by the maids and servants in his household, and because he had already developed this idea that he just can't be honest with anybody, his parents, the police, the government, his family, he felt that it would not matter whatsoever, to talk to anybody about anything that happened to him. And so, of course, like, the most heinous of crimes that are committed against him, he feels the same way. Like, who would I talk to? Who would I even tell? They would probably just tell me to be quiet. There's no point. And, to be fair to his perspective, in this 1930s Japan, he might have been right. Unfortunate as it is, he may have been totally right. Like, maybe nobody would have taken him seriously. Maybe they would have told him to just keep quiet and let it go. But also, his father was very powerful and wealthy, so maybe something would have been done. Either way, the damage was done, and Yozo, I think this just further cements this idea within him that he is not able to live as ordinary humans do, And this is very depressing, and it's, I think, maybe one of the keystone sort of memories that actually shaped his future relationships with anybody, really. Not just sexual relationships, but relationships like romantic relationships, friendships, family relationships. I think this just further cemented the idea in his mind that he was not really worth speaking up about, no matter how he felt or what happened to him. It's interesting that this is sort of juxtaposed with the meeting, the political meeting. So there's a political meeting next in the timeline here. I called it political theater because there is this meeting where a speech happens. A celebrated figure of the political party to which my father belonged had come to deliver a speech in our town. And so, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically there's this two-facedness, I guess. I don't know the word, but everybody around his father is completely two-faced. The other politicians, the other wealthy people present, the servants, everybody will say to his face and to his family that oh yes, the speech was wonderful, it was amazing, you know, I learned so much, it was so insightful. And then behind their backs they'll turn around and be like, oh, that was like the worst speech, it was so terrible, it was so boring, it just didn't mean anything. And you know, I think that this again, you know, just further deepens the divide between Yozo and his perception of humans and how humans are expected to act, and how he just sees people as sort of unable to be truthful and unable to be compassionate and all of those sorts of things. And then that basically ends the first notebook. So moving on to the second notebook, I titled the first sort of event the move, because he moves to a new place, a new school, farther away from his home. And the way he describes this is that, like, as a comedian who travels away from his hometown, he can now further develop his act and fully cement himself into that role without fear of talking to the people who actually know him or knew him since the beginning. So he has sort of a blank slate, you know, a clean start, where he starts at a new school, the clown, just as ever before, and everybody loves him for it. Even his teachers, you know, laugh at his antics and his crazy stories, because he is the clown, and that's how he gets people to like him. Except for this one boy, Takeichi, right here. So Takeichi was the first person, I guess outside his family, to see through Yozo. There is one event where Yozo is playing the fool, playing the clown, when I think he slips off a bar and like lands on his face, and the whole crowd laughs and they're all, you know, like having a good time. And then Takeichi turns to him and says, "You did that on purpose." And Yozo freezes. He's struck entirely, because this persona that he has crafted, this idea of the comedian, of the person that everybody wants him to be, was seen through, you know, like a sheet of crystal clear glass. Takeichi, this boy who he had no respect for, saw through his act. And this was striking and stunning and petrifying for Yozo. And so what does he do? At first he wants to kill him. So, but he doesn't, you know, he doesn't actually kill him, but he brings him to his house, invites him over, and they actually become friends because of that. And they both share this mutual taste for this particular painter. I forget exactly who it was. I don't know if I have that in my notes, but anyway, the painter, you know, paints these sort of stunning portraits that almost look like ghosts, like phantoms. And Yozo is so taken with them that he himself starts to try and paint in this technique. And Takeichi sees them and thinks how marvelous they are, and remarks how amazing they are and how good Yozo is. And then that becomes one of the cornerstone ideas in Yozo's mind, that he is an artist, that he can paint, that he can draw, and that he wants to pursue this, even though his father wants him to pursue a sort of more what was the word? Like a community service. He wants him to serve the community, you know, in a political, public-facing position. And so I think that this was the first instance where Yozo really saw his own possible ability to become an artist, to pursue his own creative talents and interests. But for the time being, he completely hides all of his artwork and doesn't show anybody except Takeichi. Perhaps a way of protecting his own, you know, passion that he never had to this point. And then again, we get this sort of double think where, like, in the previous book, he says that he had no hunger, right? But like in this instance, I personally feel like this could be construed as a form of hunger or passion for painting. And I think that, you know, Dazai is talking through Yozo from the future to show that like his perspective is flawed and incomplete and doesn't know, and you know, sort of jumps around a little bit in his mind, and like in some ways feels like, no, like I had never had a passion or a hunger for anything. And then at the same time, at certain instances in his life, it seems almost clear that he has a certain passion for some things. So again, another interesting little jumping out and taking the perspective from this book. So then we continue on, and he meets his next friend. His friend that would sort of pop in and out of his life for the remainder of his Tokyo life is Horiki. And Horiki is a fellow art student, but older. And Horiki introduces Yozo to the world of drink and women. And so Horiki knows all the best places to get the strongest and cheapest liquor and to find the best and cheapest women. And Yozo, living off his father's dime at this point, goes out and they drink and they, you know, visit brothels and all that sort of thing. And Yozo develops a lot of experience in dealing with women. This is sort of his blossoming into the adult that I'm not sure necessarily he wanted to become, but the adult that would inevitably eventually attract women. And backpedaling real quick, I forgot to mention, I called this previous section Takeichi's prophecies, because his first prophecy was that Yozo would go on to become a great artist. His second prophecy was that Yozo would attract many women. And so Horiki was sort of the linchpin for all of that to happen, because he introduced Yozo to this sort of seedy underground world of Ginza. And his interactions with these women and his constant drinking led him to develop the senses that would, I think, later attract women to him. You know, among his innate sort of talents and personality. And then we move on a little further, where Horiki invites Yozo to the Communist Party meeting, which is underground because it's not allowed. And Yozo finds great solace in the Communist Party. He likes that they sort of ramble on and have such a great passion for what he thinks is otherwise insignificant. He sort of likes the idea of all of these people working so hard and sneaking around and doing all this stuff for something that he personally feels doesn't really matter at all. And I think that's why he finds it so appealing, because it's like, wow, these people spend so much time and energy doing something that doesn't mean anything at all. And so this is perfect for me because I don't really find meaning in anything. And so he almost like trips into the whole thing, but he starts going to all the meetings. He does more and more stuff for the leaders and the higher ups, and eventually becomes like their guy, their go-to guy, and they like want to make him like the leader of the local like Tokyo chapter and like all this stuff. He becomes like a major figure in this underground university communist party, which was like, looking back on it, like I personally find that like totally like out of character, at least in line with the rest of the events of his life. And you know, perhaps that's why it was specifically included. But you know, maybe we can come back to that later and unpack it. But moving on, the Communist Party introduces him to one of his first sort of women entanglements, which is who he calls his comrade. And then the place he's staying at, the landlord's daughter, and then Tsuneko. These three women are the first women for him to be actually romantically involved with. The first two, the landlord's daughter and the comrade, he just sees them more of an annoyance. As somebody who can't tell the truth and plays the clown, he feels he owes it to them to humor them and humor their affection for him, but he himself feels no affection for. Whereas on the other hand, Tsuneko, who is also an extremely depressed, suicidal woman who works in like a bar, he actually feels affection for. He feels that she, and he even says specifically that she's the only woman that he ever loved. And so he starts meeting with her more regularly, and they become somewhat intertwined in their destiny. And Yozo, is Yozo, and Tsuneko is also extremely depressed. And eventually, I think Tsuneko brings up the idea of a double suicide, and Yozo agrees to it, and then they both decide to commit suicide together by going into the water and drowning. But what happens is Yozo survives. Tsuneko does not. And so we arrive at the third notebook. So at this point in Yozo's life, he has recovered physically from his initial suicide attempt. And he is now under the care of a man he calls Flatfish, who works for his father. And Flatfish has taken him in to his little antique boutique, his little antique shop, where he gets essentially zero foot traffic, and it's clear that it's basically just a front for him to probably launder the money he receives from Yozo's father. And his son also works there, who is like a Flatfish Junior. I forget his name, I just call him Junior because he's essentially like Flatfish but smaller. And they have this odd relationship, Flatfish and his son. They never talk to each other. They eat noodles in silence. They seem to just sort of live this dreary grind of a life. And they take in Yozo at the request of his father, though his father does not ever specifically state this to Yozo. Yozo later gleans that this is the relationship they had because of the money he received from Flatfish, even though Flatfish himself insisted that everything he was doing was out of, his sort of own kindness from his heart, which was definitely not true. And Yozo would later realize that, though at the time I believe he didn't fully grasp that concept. And so eventually Flatfish has this sort of dinner with sake and everything, which is unusual, and invites Yozo, and he sort of gives him almost like an ultimatum, like, what are you going to do? What do you want out of your life? And Yozo is sort of petrified by the idea, and so he runs away. He says he leaves a note that he's going to see Horiki and ask his advice on what to do, but he actually had no intention of doing that, so he just leaves. And then, without knowing exactly what he wanted to do, he actually goes and sees Horiki, who is just about to meet with a woman named Shizuko, because Horiki is selling his art to Shizuko. And when he visits Horiki, he sees that his parents are actually quite poor, and Horiki treats his parents with this sort of reverence and utmost respect for them. And Yozo is sort of off-put by this whole thing. And then the woman comes and meets with them, and just sort of almost instantaneously, within the course of one page, Yozo is living with Shizuko and helping take care of her daughter, Shigeko. And this brings me to what I thought was a particularly interesting part of the book. Yes. So this is just after he started living with Shizuko, and he says, "For about a week, I remained in a state of daze. Just outside the apartment window was a kite caught in the telegraph wires, blown about and ripped by the dusty spring wind. It nevertheless clung tenaciously to the wires, as if in affirmation of something. Every time I looked at the kites, I had to smile with embarrassment and blush. It haunted me even in dreams. So this is, again, sort of one of his philosophical musings, and I found it really interesting because I think the kite really was representative of Yozo's life at this time. It was caught in telegraph wires, blown about and ripped by the dusty wind, nevertheless clung tenaciously to the wires as if in affirmation of something. And I see this as Yozo, is the kite, and the telegraph wires maybe represent sort of maybe represent society, or his connection to society, or his connection to the people around him. And it's tattered, it's ripped, it's broken by the wind, and yet it's caught and stuck, as if in affirmation of something, as if there's a reason for it to do so. And I think that's how Yozo views his own life. He doesn't understand why he's caught in this, why he's stuck here, why all of this is happening to him. And yet, for some reason, he clings to it, as if there's something that he needs to do, there's something that needs to be done. And I really think that this particular passage is sort of evocative of Yozo's entire life, the way he just tries to cling to this idea of humanity, even if he himself can't actually interact with them, and symbolically, right, telegraph wires are used for communication, but the communication runs through the wires, and a kite that's caught on the outside between them has no actual inclination or ability to read the data that's coming through the wires. It's just caught physically on the wires, and yet remains also physically barriered from understanding and interpreting the data and conversations contained within them. So yeah, I just thought that was, in my opinion, one of the most apt and strong symbolic representations of Yozo's entire sort of life philosophy. So he stays with Shizuko and Shigeko for a while, and he starts writing these cartoons and starts selling them, but just as Yozo does, he needs to follow his own pattern of self-destruction and sort of tanks everything, even though things are actually finally going well for him. And he starts drinking and drinking more and more because he feels like he needs to earn his own money so he can go drink himself to death, essentially. And eventually he talks about this poem by before that, actually, this was a very interesting passage. He's talking to Shigeko, Shizuko's daughter, and she asks him, "Is it true that God will grant you anything if you pray for it?" And his internal monologue response was, "I was frightened even by God. I could not believe in his love, only in his punishment. Faith. That I felt was the act of facing the tribunal of justice with one's head bowed to receive the scourge of God. I could believe in hell, but it was impossible for me to believe in the existence of heaven. Why haven't you a chance? Because I disobeyed what my father told me." And then he says, "I deceived them. I was aware that everybody in the apartment house was friendly to me, but it was extremely difficult for me to explain to Shigeko how much I feared them all, and how I was cursed by the unhappy peculiarity that the more I feared people, the more I was liked, and the more I was liked, the more I feared them, a process which eventually compelled me to run away from everybody." So I really think that his time with Shizuko and Shigeko, with the kite and this sort of coming or running from God, he perhaps had his most honest conversations with himself about who he is and who he was and how he feels about the world and people and society and all of that and God and everything in between. So from here he continues on, and yeah, he gets to this poem. Let's see, where is that? Yes, he gets to this poem by Guy Charles Crow, I believed. And there's actually no translation of this poem in the book, but I do have the translation right here. Yes. And then it all starts again the next day, with only the same rules as in the night before, and that is to evade the great barbarian joys. Thus will the great sorrows be likewise, as how a toad circumvents a stone on its pathway. And so Yozo considers himself the toad. An animal lower than a dog, lower than a cat. I sluggishly moved, that's all. And, you know, this is sort of almost like the conclusion of the kite and God and now the toad. Yozo has come to the idea that that's all he is. A mere toad slinking through life, just doing the same thing over and over ad nauseum with not an end in sight, just the dregs of society that deserves no love and no compassion, and a totally bleak, pessimistic view of himself. And I think that's ultimately why he decides to leave Shizuko and Shigeko. And then he goes over to live with this madam, the madam of a bar, and she, you know, takes him in, and then he actually, for the first time in his life, seems to be happy. He just goes down and hangs out in the bar and gets drunk every day and just decides, you know what, F it, I don't even care anymore. I'm just gonna drink and live my life and do whatever I want to do, because what else is there, you know? And it's ironic, it's sad that the only real solace he ever found in his life was when he just gave up on it and decided to drink himself into a stupor, you know? That is until he meets Yoshiko, the young girl who worked at the tobacco stand across from the bar. And so we lead into the second part of Notebook 3. He marries Yoshiko after promising to give up alcohol, which of course he doesn't actually give up the alcohol, and they get married and they start living together, and Horiki comes back into his life. And I'm just going to sort of breeze through the plot here and then come back to the key elements of this part of the story, because we're almost coming up on time here. So he marries Yoshiko, he lives with her. Horiki comes back, they hang out a lot, they are best friends, but they also despise each other. One night they're drinking together on the roof, they're playing this game that Yozo invented where they categorically describe nouns as comic or tragic, which is in itself an extremely interesting conversation, which leads to Yozo contemplating the antonym of crime, and he lands on Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and sort of feels this strange interpretation of the idea that the antonym of crime is punishment, and has a hard time reconciling that idea, yet can't come up with any other possible antonym of crime. And this is when Horiki goes downstairs and witnesses Yoshiko being sexually assaulted by an acquaintance of theirs. He brings Yozo down, quite casually, I might add, and Yozo is immediately struck by this event, and sort of this begins his downward spiral into the end of his life. He once again attempts to commit suicide, but once again fails, and then becomes addicted to morphine, and eventually he writes to his father, which he doesn't receive a response from, and his brother and Flatfish come and take him to a mental institution where he stays for 3 months, and then he is taken out by his brother, and he is informed that his father has died, and he is sort of exiled into the countryside. His brother buys him a home in the country with old servants, and that's where he sort of lives the rest of his life, and that's where the third notebook ends, ending with the epilogue, where we come back to the narrator, who describes that he never actually met Yozo, but he did run into the madam of the bar and managed to speak with her about Yozo for a bit, to which the final page of the book, he says he's asking the woman about the notebooks, and she says, I haven't any idea. Oh, is the man who wrote them still alive? I haven't any idea. About 10 years ago, somebody sent me a parcel containing the notebooks and the photographs to my place in Kiyobashi. I'm sure it was Yozo who sent it, but he didn't write his address or even his name on the parcel. It got mixed up with other things during the air raids, but miraculously enough, the notebooks were saved. Just the other day, I read through them for the first time. Did you cry? No, I didn't cry. I just kept thinking that when human beings get that way, they're no good for anything. It's been 10 years. I suppose he may be dead already. He must have sent the notebooks to you by way of thanks. Some parts are rather exaggerated, I can tell, but you obviously suffered a hell of a lot at his hands. If everything written in these notebooks is true, I probably would have wanted to put him in an insane asylum myself, if I were his friend. It's his father's fault, she said unemotionally. The Yozo we knew was so easygoing and amusing, but if only he hadn't drunk. No, even though he did drink, he was a good boy, an angel. And so, just like how Donald Keene in the intro sort of brings everything full circle, I think that's exactly what this epilogue does. It sort of brings this outside perspective from Dazai as the author, talking through the narrator about Yozo, how Yozo himself was unable to see any of his own good qualities. And because of that, or perhaps as a result of something else, namely his inability to empathize with other people, with society, I believe gave him the inability to sympathize with himself. And so never saw his own innocence, his own kindness, his own compassion that he felt for other people, and instead constantly vilified himself, which in turn led to this vicious cycle of depression, self-hatred, suicidal tendencies. And I think that ultimately what this book offers is really this deep insight into how people who are afflicted with severe depression, chronic depression, and suicidal thoughts and tendencies, how at times they view the world and the perspective that they have, which is oftentimes just so self-deprecating, so full of self-hate and self-doubt, and the inability to love oneself. I think that this book really concisely and exactly gives this great insight into. And I'm sure anybody who would read this book has at some point felt some modicum of these feelings in some way. Definitely some people more than others, and definitely I'm sure some people in different ways, but the way that Dazai, writes this book, it's easy to feel like it's autobiographical. It's written so well and so concisely that it literally feels like you're reading his own notebook, as if he wrote these as an autobiography in order to just describe his life. But that's not true. It's not an autobiography. While I'm sure there must be autobiographical elements to it, it is not an autobiography. It is a work of fiction. It is a work of fiction about Yozo, and it is a work of fiction through the narrator that read Yozo's notebooks and decided to publish them. And it's written with this level of expert craftsmanship that really, really makes it feel as though you're gaining a deep insight into exactly what Dazai wants you to see and understand and feel. And it really, I feel, gives you just this perfect view into these deep, deep, deep layers of depression and perpetual sadness and inability to talk with and socialize and connect with others in an empathetic and understanding way. And there are so many, and it's peppered with so many plot points that you can all sort of point to and say, well, he's this way because of his father. He's this way because of how he felt about like this friend, about this relationship, about this woman. And you can like put it all back to the beginning about where he grew up and how he grew up and the expectations of him and his own sort of, homegrown intellect combined with all of these facets. But like really at the end of the day, it's not so much about, at least, the way I see it, it's not so much about blaming any particular incident or person of why he feels, or like of why he became that way, so much as it's just about understanding how he feels and the difficulties that he has gone through to, reach, not even reach, but just throughout his entire life. And I think that's why this is, the second best selling book in the history of Japanese literature. I think it resonates with people in so many ways, especially in Japanese culture, where it's getting a little bit better in the modern era, but like for so long, even now, Japanese culture is about keeping your head down, don't speak about the bad things or the things wrong with you or your family or society, save face, don't do anything shameful, you must be respected by the people around you. Like there's this Japanese proverb, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down, right? And that's like how Japanese people in general are sort of trained and conditioned to think about their place in society. You shouldn't act out, you shouldn't do anything special or separate, you shouldn't like try to change things or make waves, because you will be the one that's punished for that. And I think that is especially pervasive throughout this book. Every single time Yozo is trying to interact with other people or form relationships or bonds, all he can think about is this perpetual fear of just what might happen, of letting people down, of this chasm, this gulf between him and other people and their interpretation of him and what he says and how he acts, and the shame that he might bring upon himself and his father and his family. And it's like the irony of it all, right, is that it's exactly because of this fear that he does all of the things that he's the most afraid of. Like if he was just able to let go of that fear of disappointing people, of letting down his father, of trying to, craft this perfect image of who people want him to be. If he could just let all of that go, he would actually be able to form meaningful connections with meaningful people around him. And, I don't mean to say that lightly. I'm not saying it's simple, like, oh, just flick a switch and you're fine. But, what I'm trying to say is I'm just pointing out, this sort of impossible, difficult, full of struggle dichotomy that is the human condition. Like, we all feel this way to a certain extent. We all feel like, I'm so worried about this happening, or I'm so afraid of being seen this way that I don't want to do that thing. I would rather just make up this idea of this person that I think you want to see, and I'll just act that way, because if I do that, then I'll be that person and you'll like me for that, right? But like, the reality is that people like the authenticity that comes with being yourself, with being who you are, and expressing your own actual real desires, and your own, what you think and how you feel, and genuine, earnest connections that you want to craft with the people around you. Those are the things that get people to actually resonate with you and listen to what you say and want to, get to know you. And yet Yozo spent his entire life running away from all of those things. And I think, that is one of the ultimate tragedies of his story. And I think that is one of the greatest lessons that can be taken from this novel, right? It's not so much about not becoming Yozo, right? Because I think to some degree all of us are Yozo. Maybe not all the time, but sometimes, and to varying degrees, right? Like, we all have lows. We all know to some extent what it feels like to be devoid of emotion, or devoid of passion, or be devoid of the will to even get up the next day, And I think that is what this book is so important for. It's so important to read, to gain that understanding, to gain that insight, to see so amazingly concisely described this depiction of depression and anxiety, and the crushing weight of it all, to really be able to, in such a honestly short novel, see it so accurately depicted, I think gives such a great deep insight into the difficulties of these things, that it allows us to turn that, that mirror that's pointing from Dazai to Yozo onto ourselves, and to see why we struggle with certain things, why we struggle to form connections, why we struggle to empathize with others, and in turn sympathize with ourselves. And this brings me to the final point, which is that near the end of the book, let me see if I can find it. Everything passes. Yeah. Right near the end of the book, he says, so this is after he goes right into the mental hospital. I was no longer a criminal, I was a lunatic. But no, I was definitely not mad. I have never been mad even for an instant. They say I know that most lunatics claim the same thing. Excuse me. What it amounts to is that people who get put into this asylum are crazy, and those who don't are normal. God, I ask you, is non-resistance a sin? I had wept at that incredibly beautiful smile Horiki showed me, and forgetting both prudence and resistance, I had got into the car that took me here, and now I had become a madman. Even if released, I would be forever branded on the forehead with the word madman, or perhaps reject, disqualified as a human being. I had now ceased utterly to be a human being. And, coming back to the actual title of the book, Donald Keene himself, the translator, said that more literally, the translation of the Japanese title to English would be something like disqualified from being human. And so this is what we finally see at the end of the book. After multiple suicide attempts, after his total disconnection from society, after his loss of the ability to even suffer, he finally becomes disqualified from being human. He more or less achieves this final goal. And perhaps you could see this as sort of a cautionary tale, right? Or part of the side of caution, right? It's like, if we don't see what this book is trying to show us, if we don't look at it with open eyes and earnestly, understand the message of this book, then perhaps we ourselves become closer and closer to disqualifying ourselves as human beings. And I think, ultimately bringing everything back around, this is what it means, right? To be human is to suffer. And when we lose that ability to suffer is when we lose our humanity. And so much of our lives, it feels like we're always running from suffering. We're running from the idea of suffering. We don't want to suffer anymore. We just want it to be over, right? But that's running away from your humanity. That's running away from the life that we so strongly cling to. To be human is to suffer. And I think that's partly what Dazai was trying to convey through this book. At least that's one of the messages that I got from it. And we're running a little over an hour now, and so I think that will wrap things up. There were some more things I wanted to discuss, but I think we can leave it there for now. If there's anything else you guys want to talk about, let me know, and we can always go further with this. But with all that being said, just a couple last things I wanted to say in relation to the topics we discussed today. If you personally, are dealing with any of these problems, it's very perfectly reasonable, and I would recommend it. Consider seeking a therapist. They are trained and educated and extremely helpful in dealing with all of these complex emotions and thoughts, and can really help you work through any sort of psychological issues that you are dealing with. Even if it's just sometimes you have those downswings and you're not sure how to deal with them or what to do with them, a therapist can be a great help for that. And if you are in America, the United States, there is this website called Psychology Today where you can enter your city or zip code, and it will list you a number of therapists that are available in your region, and you can do a free consultation with any of them to see if they would be a good match potentially for you. The other thing I would like to say is just, if you have dealt with specifically any suicidal thoughts or tendencies, please do consider next time reaching out to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Their number is here on the screen. They also even have an online chat. There are always resources available to help, and there will always be these downswings and hard times in our life, but there will also always inevitably be the upswings that come back from them. So whatever you're going through at any given point, just remember that there are people out there that will and can and would like to help you with whatever it is you're struggling with. But yeah, I didn't want to, it's not about ending this on a bad or sad note or anything like that. It's just I wanted to offer some more resources in case this book brought up any traumatic or difficult topics for you to explore. These are just different possible avenues for you to look into if you're struggling with any of those things. But yeah, I think that will about do it for this episode of A Few Pages. I know this book was particularly heavy, but I do think that there are some really important messages and musings, philosophical musings on life that we can all glean from it and take away, you know. So, you know, let's strive to connect with more people, to empathize with the struggles of others, and perhaps most importantly, sympathize with ourselves and come back and give ourselves the love and attention we feel that everybody outside of ourselves deserves. So yeah, I think that will about do it for this month's episode. If you got this far and you're interested in the next meeting, definitely give me any recommendations you may have for the next book. I have not decided yet. I haven't even really corralled a group of candidates yet. So anything that you would recommend, let me know in the comments below. And, you know, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.